Welcome to this third keynote speech at the Bergen Summer Research School 2020. In this time when knowledge and science is contested, we thought it was important to have one keynote that talked about academic practice and knowledge production. So we decided to invite Professor Bjørn Rekdal from Western Norway University of Applied Sciences, who has worked a lot on academic citations, bad citation practices, and how these things evolve and develop in quite serious ways in academia. So I look forward to hearing your talk, and we'll have some time for questions and discussions afterwards. So let me just share the screen here, and I'll give you the virtual floor.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. I have to say, I'm not very familiar with all these new technologies, but I'm going to do my best. I have a traditional PowerPoint down here, and in order to be 100% certain that I arrive at the conclusion, I'm going to present it first. As Håvard said, I'm going to talk about academic citations and fake science, how sloppy citations of different kinds contribute to the production of false knowledge. And my main message here today is embarrassingly simple. It's something that you have heard before, that you should strive to consult primary sources. That is the most important. And I'm going to try to use some examples in order to illustrate why this is important. The other point, which is number 2 here, is that you should never pretend to have consulted a source you have not seen. Now, there are different ways of saying that message. One of them is that you should never plagiarize a citation, or that you should never cite directly a source you haven't seen. It doesn't mean that you cannot cite a source you haven't seen, but you cannot source it directly. You cannot cite it directly. If you cite a source you haven't seen, for example, a primary source, you should, one example is to use a citation of the type Håvard cited in Bjørn. That means I've not consulted Håvard. I've just read in Bjørn's contribution, and I'm employing a secondary source. Now that is, in some cases, it can mean that your message has a kind of weakness, and in some cases it can be quite dangerous. Now, one thing, as Håvard mentioned, this is something that is, the issue of fake science is more important than ever. In order to represent an alternative to the many anti-science movements that we are seeing today, it is more important than ever to avoid the pitfalls of bad citations. Now, 5 years ago or 6 years ago, I wrote an article with this title, Academic Urban Legends, and the title here contains a kind of paradox. What is characteristic of an urban legend is that it is usually not true at all. It doesn't have anything to do with the real world, reality. So if there is one place that urban legends should not circulate, it should be in scientific publications. Now, after I published that article 6 years ago, it got a lot of attention, not because it's brilliant in any sense of the word, but because many people said it's a fascinating story about how academics are using sloppy citations and contribute in a spectacular way to the creation of false knowledge. The article is dealing with the myth that there is a lot of iron in spinach. And on top of that myth, there is another myth that this false knowledge has been produced because of academics. One academic during the 19th century who made a decimal point error. So this story is a very good example of something very small, something very tiny, causing, having disastrous consequences. You know, millions of parents, they have tortured their children to eat something they usually abhor, namely spinach. And all of this comes from a small decimal point error. It's fascinating, isn't it? And it's a brilliant example of how a small axe can fell a huge oak. The conclusion of that article is that the decimal point error that made the world eat spinach for no reason didn't occur. So the myth about the myth is also false. And what happened afterwards was that people who read the article from different fields, they sent me emails. This is happening in my field of science too. And they have provided me with a huge collection of new academic urban legends. So I have more than enough material to continue writing about this topic until I die. But there is another paradox in this, and that is that one of the reasons why these academic urban legends can circulate in scientific publications is that people are not consulting primary sources. They are not following the principle of striving to use primary sources. And this leads me to another paradox. It has never been easier to consult primary sources than today. Just a couple of decades ago, it could take me 3 or 4 weeks in order to obtain a book from the library. Today, I can obtain the same book in digital format within just a few seconds. But despite the fact that things have become so much more easily available, you see that academic urban legends are spreading, and they are maybe even more frequent than they used to be. So despite these fantastic tools we have for making secure the quality of the knowledge we are passing on, we see that very few people are using it. They are not employing the chances we have for quality control, and the academic urban legends are probably more frequent than ever. Now, unfortunately, you didn't get the opportunity to come to Norway this time, and Bergen. The weather today is excellent. That's very rare for this town. But Norway at this time of the year usually is a nice place to visit. You didn't get the chance, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about Norwegian national symbols as a kind of compensation. We Norwegians are immensely proud of 2 inventions. One of them is the cheese cutter. And you see a monument here of the biggest cheese cutter in the world. The problem with the cheese cutter as a national symbol is that, well, it is something that works, as an internal symbol, something we all have an affectionate relationship to. We all have numerous cheese cutters in our drawers. But what is unfortunate is that nobody else is using it. Very few people outside of Norway, they are using the cheese cutter. So it's a kind of, well, in the Nordic countries, you find quite a few people who are using it. But if I go to Spain and I boast about coming from the country that invented the cheese cutter, the Spaniards, they won't be much impressed by that because they don't know what this instrument is. So it doesn't work very well as a national symbol. Now this one works better. This is the paperclip. That was invented by Johan Wohler in 1899. He then submitted his patent application both in Germany and in the United States. And this product is now produced in the US alone. 11 billion paper clips are produced every year. And we all know that symbol as a kind of, it's indicating, for example, email attachments and so on. Billions of people, they are looking at a paper clip, a Norwegian paper clip every day. Johan Wohler, he came from the eastern part of Norway, and he had a short life, but he is celebrated in many ways together with the paperclip. This is a 7-meter paperclip erected in Oslo. So you see, we Norwegians are very fond of building big monuments. We are very much concerned about having the biggest of everything, ending up in the Guinness Book of Records. And this is another example, 7 meters tall, 650 kilos. And this particular monument was erected in Oslo in connection with the 90 years anniversary of the Norwegian paperclip. Now, 10 years later, there was another anniversary, the 100 years anniversary of the Norwegian paperclip. We issued a stamp, and what is special about this stamp is that it has the front page of the primary source as a watermark behind the paperclip. You can see patent schrift and the name of Johan Wohler, 1899. What is special, the reason why I'm telling you this story is that this is the best example I know of the embarrassing consequences of not consulting the primary source. Because for 70 years, no Norwegian got the idea of opening the front page of that document you can see in the background, the patent application. If they had done so, they would have seen that Johan Wohler, our local hero, he did invent a kind of paperclip, but it looked totally different from the one depicted on the stamp or the monument, the 7-meter monument. He invented a kind of, I don't have an image of it here, but it looked very different. But furthermore, it was totally useless. It didn't work at all as a paperclip. And even worse, it was never put into production. And even more embarrassing, it turned out that the paperclip was commercially produced in the United States at least 7 years before our local hero, Johan Wohler, invented it. So this is taken from an American journal, The American Lawyer, 1893. And you see the ad at the bottom of the page. If we make a close-up, you can see something very similar to the monument and the picture of the paperclip on the Norwegian stamp celebrating this national symbol. So we Norwegians, we have a very close relationship to the rather unfortunate consequences sometimes of not consulting the primary source. Now the whole story you can read in this article. Unfortunately, it's in Norwegian, but if you look up in Wikipedia, you will get a short version of this fantastic story of the national disaster caused by unwillingness to consult primary sources. Now, this is another example of the rather unfortunate consequences of not consulting a primary source. This is taken from parasitology. O. Uplavici was a Czech scientist. He made a discovery that a certain type of amoeba could be transferred from human beings to cats. That happened in the 19th century, and he was cited heavily for 51 years because of that discovery. Now, he died in 1938, and Clifford Dobell, he wrote this obituary about U. Uplavici. The special thing about this story is that U. Uplavici was a ghost. He didn't exist. He was never born. But still, you have an obituary about Dr. U. Uplavici. The reason for this is that the name of the person who discovered that this type of amoeba could be transferred from human beings to cats, his name was actually Jaroslav Hlawa. Totally different name. And the picture you can see here on the slide is the picture of Jaroslav Hlawa. He wrote an article in 1887 with the title U. Uplavici, which is Czech for on dysentery, or in more common words, on bloody diarrhea. So this is the obituary of Dr. on bloody diarrhea. And what is more remarkable was that Dr. on bloody diarrhea was cited for 51 years before somebody got the idea of consulting the primary source. Jaroslav Hlawa's publication in 1887 was read by Clifford Dobell, and he discovered what has gone wrong. And it's hard to, to see disastrous consequences for this misunderstanding. Of course, it was sad for Jaroslav Hlawa not to be credited his discovery. But anyway, the story about Dr. on bloody diarrhea is, it doesn't serve well in order to illustrate that this can have disastrous consequences in some cases. Now, this is another type of ghost, a ghost article. The reference at the top here, you see the name of the article, The Art of Writing a Scientific Article. It's quite an attractive title, isn't it? And especially combined with the name of the journal, Journal of Scientific Communication. Sounds like an article that must be very attractive for PhD students, I would guess. But again, we find the phenomenon of something being cited that does not exist. This article has been cited, well, when I looked this up 3-4 years ago, it had been cited 770 times. I looked up yesterday, now it's 1,099. So how is this possible that an article like this, it doesn't exist, but it has been cited more than 1,000 times? The story behind this is a little bit complicated, but you can read the whole story in this. It's a kind of blog, The Mystery of the Phantom Reference, written by Anvil Harsing. This is open access at the, well, you can just Google it and you will find the text. The point here was that this article or this reference was made up by Elsevier, the publisher, in order to serve as a template for contributors to one of their websites. So people just copied this example, and they ended up violating one of the principles I mentioned at the very first slide. You should never cite anything you haven't read yourself. At least you shouldn't cite it directly. Now, this is an image that can serve as a kind of explanation for two good reasons for striving to consult primary sources. Now, if we think of these people as authors, they are reading each other's stuff, they are passing on a statement or a piece of information, and they are all relying on secondary sources. They are relying on the author to the left of each one of them. Now, if they don't take the time to consult the primary source, they trust that the next person, the person to the left, has gotten it right. Very often, that is not the case. Well, very often, that's maybe to exaggerate a little bit, but in some cases, you can observe what I call the academic whisper game. Things that change a little bit for every link it passes through. So when you have a long chain of sources like this, you can sometimes get dramatic effects. And in some cases, you can see that very concrete pieces of information, like a number, can change. For example, 7.9 can turn into 8, can turn into 8.0, can turn into almost 10, and then to 10.0. So if you compare the first arrow and the last arrow, you can see that the difference is quite great. And that means in scientific terms that the quality of the information has been reduced. If you compare with urban legends, ordinary urban legends, this change of color can mean that the story has gotten better. But in scientific publications, this is in virtually all cases the same as the reduction of quality. Now, there is another aspect here, is that the poor woman to the left, she is not able to evaluate the reliability of the original source here, the one we can see to the left. If that source turns out to be, for example, Crocodile Dundee, that's an unreliable source. That would be an important piece of information in order for her to decide whether she should trust the information she is passing on. Now, this image is this is a picture of Henry Mencken, a kind of similar guy from I think it was 1917. He wrote an article about the history of the bathtub in the United States. And it was all made up. Everything in the article was made up. Nothing was correct. And that article has been circulating it was originally a newspaper article, but it was soon picked up by academics, and it has been circulating for more than 100 years now in academic publications. It's still being cited. Now, this example is another type of ghost, a ghost statistic. And one example of the forms of the statement is that when an educated girl earns income, she is reinvesting 90% in her family compared to 35% for a boy. Now, the author of this paper, Catherine Muller, she tried her best in order to find out where these figures came from, these statistics. Not very favorable for us men, of course. It was impossible. It was impossible to find out where it came from, but she could observe the whisper game phenomenon in the figure. The figure was changing between 30%, 35%, 40%. But again, we have a ghost circulating in between different sources, some of them academic. Now, this is the most spectacular examples I've seen of the whisper game effect. 30 million street children in Brazil. Now we are talking about the 1980s. That figure is simply impossible because in 1983, according to the United Nations, there were only 29.6 million children in urban areas of Brazil. So that can't be the case, that you have more street children than children. A much more common figure that was circulating at the same time was 7 million. But still, it's a very, very large number, and it doesn't have anything to do with reality at all. This is a consequence of the academic whisper game, or sources citing each other's in circles, or rather spirals. Because Tobias Hecht, who was doing research on this, he was able to observe that this figure was, when he was going back in sources, they were citing each other's in circles and all the time pumping up the figure. His estimate was that there was at most 39,000 street children in Brazil at the time, but it has been multiplied by 700 due to the academic whisper game effect. Now, this is something I'm very proud of. I have been plagiarized. This is the yellow text here, is something I wrote in my PhD thesis about the Iraq people in Tanzania. And 10 years later, I found the same text in a book published by a Swiss academic publisher. And this particular author, he had taken the conclusion of my whole thesis. This is from the introduction where I'm summing up 10 years of research in Tanzania. So it was, so this guy who wrote the book, he found exactly the same as I did. So he was in a way confirming my findings, but not in a very convincing way, I think, because the way he had plagiarized, he did it in such a primitive way that anybody who reads his contribution together with my contribution will see that this comes from one source. So his book and my PhD thesis can never be taken as mutually reinforcing each other. So in a way, you can say that this type of plagiarism, text plagiarism, it is bad, of course, as a way of cheating. It is theft. He's, he's taking credit for, my research. But apart from that, this type of plagiarism is no threat to the quality of knowledge. Because if it's read by many, it will be exposed. And if it's not read by anybody, you can say that it doesn't cause any damage when it comes to quality of knowledge. Now this is, so primitive plagiarism is no threat to the production of knowledge. More sophisticated forms of plagiarism are much more dangerous, and one of them is what I call citation plagiarism. And in order to explain that, I have to use a concrete example. It is slightly modified and simplified from a text written by this man, David Bellamy. He was a botanist. He has published some 41 books, and he is a well-known so-called climate skeptic. He doesn't believe in global warming. And in 2005, well, before we go to the text, I have to tell you a small story about what happened yesterday. I looked up David Bellamy on Wikipedia, and I discovered that he was dead. He died in December last year. So that was a sad thing to find out, because I've been using his text for a number of years. I've never met him, but I know how he looks like. And this picture is taken from Wikipedia. And going through my PowerPoint last night, I had the shocking experience of discovering that he has a mouse in his ear. I don't know if you saw that, but if you take a close up, there's no doubt. On this Wikipedia picture of this scientist, there is a mouse in his ear. If any of you find out where it comes from, why it's there, please send me an email. But anyway, he wrote an article called Glaciers Are Cool in 2005. It's a letter to the editor of New Scientist. Now, in that letter to the editor, he claimed that 555 out of 625 glaciers worldwide under observation by the World Glacier Monitoring Service have been growing since the 1980s, since 1980. Now, of course, David Bellamy, he had a source when he provided that figure. He didn't cite it in that letter, but he came up with it later. So now we are going to use this as an example of how things can go wrong when you plagiarize a citation. So in this model, you have source B, David Bellamy, with his mouse, and the statement that 555 out of, and so on. Now he had a source where he learned this from, source A. Now, if you take a close look at that, you won't discover a new mouse, but you will see that the figure is different, 55% instead of 555. Now, what happened in Bellamy's case is most likely this. If you look at the standard keyboard, the number 5 and the percent sign, they share the same key. So he forgot to push the shift button when he wanted to write 55%, so it turned into 555. Okay, so this is something that can happen to any of us. We all make errors. The point is that we need to have mechanisms for correcting the errors or repairing our small accidents. Okay, so the big question here is that if we come along as source C, reader C turned into source C, we are reading David Bellamy's contribution, we want to use this figure, 555. And it serves well, of course, if you are a climate skeptic and you want to write a chronicle or whatever in order to convince more people that we should worry more about the coming ice age than global warming. The big question here is, what do we put here as our citation? What should we put instead of the question marks? There are several options here. One common one is to simply put in the B, to cite David Bellamy. That's the source where we found the information. Now, the weakness of that option is that you are hiding the fact that David Bellamy, source B, got this from source A. You're hiding the fact that this has gone through a chain of sources and therefore that it has a kind of a weakness, the weakness inherent in the whisper game. So, and this is very common to, cite B and then get on with the rest of the article. But it has an obvious weakness. Of course, the best solution in this case is to follow the principle at my very first slide, to use the A here as an address, to go back to source A. Then we are following the principle of consulting the primary source or the assumed primary source. And then we will immediately see that this figure is wrong and we are able to correct the wrong figure we have in our manuscript. Okay, so that's the best solution. Another solution is to write A cited in B. As I mentioned earlier, this is a kind of combination of laziness and utmost honesty. You don't take the time to go back and consult the primary source. You trust source B, David Bellamy, and you tell your readers that you have done so. You're telling the readers that you haven't done your job in going back to consult the primary source, and that you got the information about the primary source from source B, and the readers, they will understand that this is the result of a long chain of sources. We should be very careful with this information. Okay, now the third option here is what I call citation plagiarism. I put it in quotation marks here because many people, they won't agree that this is a kind of plagiarism. But I would insist that this is a kind of plagiarism because you are pretending that you have done the job that source B has done. Source B, David Bellamy, he has consulted source A. When you copy his citation to source A, you are pretending that you have done so. And this is where the disaster occurs. You simply copy the A into your own text, and then you end up in a situation where you are citing source A without having seen source A. Then you risk getting what we call the cat in the bag. I don't think that expression works in English, but I think it's something like pig in a poke, or you get something unwanted. And in this case, we would get an error because we haven't gone back to the source A. And then what happens is that you get two different sources with completely wrong information. They are saying exactly the same with reference to source A. Both of them are completely wrong. Now, when new readers come along, they are perhaps reading only source C and source B. Maybe source A is difficult to get, to obtain. It's not open access. Maybe it's written in the Czech language. I don't know. But it's more than enough. When you have two different sources saying exactly the same thing, that's a very good reason to trust that this is true. And then it becomes very tempting to pass on this as knowledge that has been that has undergone some quality control, and it will become very tempting to continue to plagiarize the citation. And then you get this phenomenon of academic urban legends, where you see huge flocks of academics saying exactly the same thing, and which is completely wrong. Now, many of these stories, they can be amusing, like the story of Dr. Bloody Diarrhea, or maybe the Norwegians who believe that they invented the paperclip. But when it comes to the production of false knowledge about climate change, it becomes really serious, because that information is being used by politicians who make decisions that are important in order to do something with the problem. The full story, you can read it on this link. The journalist George Monbiot was the one who exposed this. And he went back to the primary source, the World Glacier Monitoring Service, providing the information that was contained in David Bellamy's letter to the editor, and I simply replied this way: "This is complete bullshit." It reminds me of the story of Donald Trump a couple of years back. He said something very similar. He said the ice caps are at record level. He didn't provide a citation or any proof of that. He's not particularly good at doing that, providing citations, but in that case, nobody understood what he meant. But it might be that he was inspired by David Bellamy, I don't know, through a long chain of sources. Now, this slide is my last one, and this is a kind of escape slide. I was going to use another example of the tragic consequences of not consulting primary sources and citation plagiarism. But this example is actually well written down in an article in Slate magazine. You see the title here, Bad Footnotes Can Be Deadly, Bad Citations Can Be Deadly. And it is an argument that part of the explanation for the American opioid epidemic is that academics have been sloppy with their citations. And one particular type of sloppiness that has played a role is citation plagiarism. But I'm not going to explain that in detail now. If you are interested, you can just Google the title of that paper. It's open access, and I might be able to provide some additional information if you send me an email. But then I think I leave it there. And then I'm supposed to click at stop share, I think. Is that right? Okay.
That's right. Thank you so much, Bjørn. That was both amusing, but also a bit scary. So let's have a seat. And if you want to sit here, I can take the chair here. And we are now at safe Corona distance, I think, but at the same time close enough to be able to have a conversation. So there's some shocking revelations here. I may have eaten spinach for no reason, and the paperclip may not be Norwegian. It's yeah.
You thought it was, right?
I thought it was.
Yeah.
That's I've learned that since childhood. So this is, but it's it's a funny anecdote. But of course, I also say it's a very, very serious and potentially deadly topic. So we can take questions from those of you who are watching. Please, if you're in Zoom, use the Q&A tag or tab, and I will follow up that and relay the questions to Ole Bjørn. But I wanted to start by one question. Is this happening more and more now, do you think? I mean, I think it's hard to measure, of course, but is this a growing trend? Is this something that's being that's increasing in tendency?
I think it's very difficult to say. It's tempting, you know, when you get old, it's very tempting to say that everything was so much better during the war. But I'm simply not certain. But what is certain is that, as I mentioned earlier, that it has become extremely easier to obtain primary sources, to check the quality of the information we are passing on. But what is obvious is that many academics nowadays, they don't use this opportunity to use the tools like these databases and the software like EndNote. EndNote is a fantastic tool in order to check the quality of the information you're passing on in articles. But I think that part of the problem here is that students and academics are extremely busy. So despite the fact that this operation takes just a few seconds now, not 3 weeks, as 10, 20, 30 years ago, they don't have the time. And it's sad to observe.
Yeah. So there's a comment and question from Jeppe Kolding here, who points to this, that academic education and production, it's increasingly speeding up and expanding. we're expected to produce more and more, and that this may be a reason for why we're seeing this kind of practice. Do you think that's part of the reason?
Yeah, I think his point is, I think that's the most important explanation for the phenomenon. One thing you mentioned the paperclip, and that you believe that it was Norwegian. Some Norwegians, they have believed that for 70 years. And, even though this Lars Rode wrote the article I was referring to, now he has documented that this is not true at all. But because it has stuck in the minds of Norwegians for 70 years, it means that it's very dangerous to confront it. So, I mean, for those people who are, planning, confronting Norwegians with the fact that the paperclip is not Norwegians, don't do it. It's dangerous. You may be in for a fight because you can't you cannot change knowledge like that very easily. And that's part of the problem with the urban legends.
Or bring the documentation with you so you can show that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that always helps, but
yeah. That's possible.
So there's a question that asks you to specify. Do you conclude? One person asks that in all circumstances we must only cite primary sources. Do you think there are good reasons to have these kind of lazier citations occasionally?
Well, I think that in the case, the example I was using, when David Bellamy is saying a thing like that, 555 out of 625, that's a typical example of a case where it is you have to consult the primary source, because it's a very concrete piece of evidence, and it is quite surprising. At least it was for me. For me, it would be obvious that in this case, I have to consult the primary source in order to check, to verify whether it's true. But having said that, if we are going to consult primary sources for everything, it means that, if you're stating that the Earth is going around the sun, you don't go back to Copernicus, 1463, page 575 or something like that. And so you have to employ a certain degree of common sense. Yeah. And very often you can say, if you have written a book and you are summing up research on a particular topic, it's more than enough to, if I grab a point from a paragraph in your book, I can cite Håvard. And not, I don't need to mention, all these different authors or contributors that you have based your analysis on. So it's, the principle should be followed, but it should be employed with common sense.
And there's another, building on another question here in the chat. I mean, even citing the primary source, there's this multiplication of these journals now that have poor review processes, and this has become an industry where we don't even know that the peer-reviewed journals provide good information. Right? We see this a lot of this corona research, several articles, even in established journals, have been retracted because so how do we deal with this? I mean, if an article, the question here was, if you're faced with a dilemma citing an article from a journal with a history of poor peer review, but it has the information that connects to your research, how do we deal with that?
That's the proliferation of so-called predatory open access journals is a huge problem, because it makes it so much more difficult to sort out what is high quality, what is bad quality. And I remember that some 10, 12 years ago, I was coordinating some programs with numerous PhD students. And at that time, we didn't know anything about predatory open access journals. And several of our students, they wrote excellent papers that was published in one of these journals, next to complete rubbish, low quality papers. So it means that even if you know that this journal is there's something suspicious about it, you cannot decide that all the papers are worthless. Mm. So it's an enormous problem in finding out what is reliable and what is not.
Yeah.
And the only solution I can think of is that you have to scrutinize the paper.
Yeah.
And you have to scrutinize the sources on which the paper has been based.
Yeah. So another question here is how do you give your advice on how to identify fake science? Like, and that's what you're saying now.
Yeah. Well, there can be several reasons for the creation of fake science, like fabrication of data or falsifying data and so on. I'm dealing with the way sloppy citations are producing fake science or false knowledge. And in order to identify that, I think that we just have to get used to scrutinizing the sources. When we see something in brackets, like Håvard 2011, we should use that as an address in order to find out whether it's true what you say that this particular source is telling you. Mm. And it's one thing that I think is maybe the most disappointing when it comes to my digging into the way academics are using citations, is that how all these sloppy citations pass through the peer review process. It means that the peer reviewers, they are maybe reading the article thoroughly. Maybe they evaluate the methodology thoroughly, but they don't look up the sources. Because in many cases, the sources say something completely different from what the author claims. And you cannot discover that unless you consult the source, whether it's a primary source or another source.
But it's already a big job of, I mean, I act as a peer reviewer sometimes, and it's a big job of just reading the text and giving feedback on the argument and the structure and all this. I mean, having also to go back and check their sources, it makes the job even bigger. I wonder if that's feasible, or we need another system of quality control for journals.
I don't know if you need another system, but there are some practical arrangements. I don't remember who suggested it, but I think it's a very good idea that when an author is submitting a paper to a journal, he should provide, either a working link to the source or a paper copy. That's very old-fashioned. Yeah. Maybe a paper copy of the page that he is citing.
Yeah. I see more and more journals now are asking for the data sets. You can upload the data sets, and it's not,
exactly.
It's not part of the paper, but it's available to reviewers. And if it's published, I guess it's also available to readers.
Yeah, and the same should apply to the use of sources.
Yeah.
And then one very interesting thing there is that if you do that, you can deal with another problem that has certainly come up as a new phenomenon, namely the existence of citation clubs. Mm. Yeah. That we are citing each other in order to increase the impact factor of a particular journal, or maybe the citation frequency of a colleague. Yeah. If I'm putting in citations to you at every occasion, then maybe you can use that figure, that blue figure in Google Scholar. You can use that as an argument in order to get a higher salary. Yeah. And maybe not here in Norway, but in the US, for example, I think you can do that. So the abuse of citations in order to generate profit in the form of a higher impact factor or a higher citation frequency, an enormous problem. Mm.
There's another question here about quantitative versus qualitative studies. And in qualitative studies, we don't use numbers in the same way. And then our material and data may be harder to scrutinized. Say these are field notes that you have in your diary, for example. How does that change things, do you think, or is it harder to verify qualitative research?
Well, it's I think that deals with what you mentioned about making data sets available.
Yeah.
Most likely, it's easier when it comes to quantitative methods. That you have some tables and statistics and things like that. But when it comes to qualitative material, it's I would guess that it's not that common to make it available, and of course that means that it's not that easy to check or verify whether what you are writing in your article, whether that corresponds to what the informants actually said. But that is what I'm concerned with is the way researchers are using other existing sources. And then it is possible to, they are available. I mean, even the article by Jaroslav Flava from 1887 in the Czech language, it's possible to obtain that and to check whether people are citing it in a correct way. So I think that when it comes to the correct use of citations, I don't see any major difference between qualitative and quantitative research.
So, I mean, you have lots of material here to work with. You said you have enough stuff to work on until you pass away. Are you planning to keep working on this, or is this becoming sort of a specialty field for you?
Well, yes, certainly. I think it's a very, it's great fun. I mean, to find stories like the one about Uplavici or Dr. Bloody Diarrhea and these paper clips. Of course, most of these cases are cases where it's not something that I found. I just got an email from somebody who told me the story. This is exactly the same as with the spinach story. And then I start reading, and then I maybe dig a little bit additionally, and then I find the story. But then, so it's great fun. But then you stumble across stories like the one about the American opioid epidemic. I was going through hundreds of different sources, citing a particular source, published in 1980, concluding that opioids, they are not particularly addictive. That publication has been cited 700 times, at least 400 times, in order to argue that we should prescribe opioids for minor pain conditions more often than we do. So this is now that particular source from 1980, that is a 5-sentence letter to the editor of New England Journal of Medicine. It is not a scientific study at all. A letter to the editor that has been cited so many times, it has been blown out of proportions, and it has, of course, it hasn't caused the opioid epidemic, but it has contributed to the spread of the false information that opioids are not particularly addictive. So that's an example that, after all, this is, well, great fun, but it is bloody serious.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but this really shows. I mean, you've had many funny anecdotes, but it also shows the seriousness of this issue. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge of this and the examples that you've been able to dig up and discuss this with us. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. And to all the PhD students around the world, whatever you do, don't plagiarize a citation. Consult primary sources.